we have to recapture this idea that the Eucharist is something more than just me and God. It is about us and God. The Eucharist is political in two senses. First, it forms us as a people. It's secondly political because the Eucharist is
Welcome to Finding Communion. I'm Rosemary Ford, the editor of Parable, the magazine of the Roman Catholic Diocese of Manchester. I'm here with Bob Dunn, our excellent director of public policies for the diocese. And we're here to talk about the politics, the Eucharist, the common good, as a companion piece to the Parable column, Finding Communion. Here on our second episode, we're going to talk about why the Eucharist is political. Thank you so much for joining us, and now Finding Communion. So, Bob, here we are with our second podcast to talk about, why the Eucharist is political. And I think for so many people, the Eucharist is just something that they think about on Sunday at church. So, probably one of the first things we should do is probably define what is the Eucharist and why is it political? So let's start there.
The Eucharist is the source and the summit of who we are as Catholics and what we do as Catholics. It is the enduring presence of the risen Lord among us. It is the enduring sign of God's infinite love for us. It is what makes us the church. And so what we celebrate in the Eucharist is something that we are called to bring to the wider world. I think when most people hear the words Eucharist and politics mentioned in the same sentence, they probably think about the communion wars and the whole thing about whether Catholic politicians should, in certain circumstances, be barred from receiving the Eucharist. But whatever one's views on that might be, and obviously even bishops are of differing minds on that front. Nobody wants the world to think that when it comes to politics and the Eucharist, all that the Eucharist means is that it is a disciplinary tool of some sort. It's infinitely more than that to us. The Eucharist is political, I think, in two senses. First, it forms us as a people. It forms us into a polis, the Greek word for city, the city-state, a group of people working together as citizens for the common good of that polis. The Eucharist forms us as a people. And it's secondly political because the Eucharist is an impetus to service on behalf of the wider polis, the wider world. It is done on behalf of the wider world. When we celebrate the Eucharist, we are exercising our baptismal priesthood to pray on behalf of the world. That's why, for instance, in the prayers of the faithful at Mass, those prayers come after the catechumens are dismissed from the assembly, because the act of praying those prayers is something that is reserved to the members of the baptized assembly. So we have to recapture this idea that the Eucharist is about something more than just me and God. It is about us and God. And that's why, as Pope Francis says, politics is a form of charity, one of the highest forms of charity, because it seeks the common good. And so I'll consider that we've been successful in our work in the public square if we can convince people to see politics not as an act of individualism or an act of power, but rather as another way of carrying out the Lord's command that we wash one another's feet.
That makes so much sense. And, it's interesting that another word for the Eucharist is often communion. Going to communion is how we refer to it as Catholics. I wonder how that connection has always been made. And I mean, if you think about it, I guess from the beginning, from the first Eucharist at the Last Supper, it's always been about community, hasn't it?
Absolutely. And I think that there's a lot of similarity there between the way that we've come to see our liturgical actions as being individual, and the way that we have come to see our political activity as being individualized. In both circumstances, the liturgical and the secular, we have to recover the idea that we're all in this together.
That makes so much sense. You mentioned politics and charity and how they're connected. Can you tell us more about that and how you see those two working together in terms of the Eucharist?
If we walked out into the street here today and we asked people about where they would put politics and where they would put charity on some imaginary line, the dots could probably not be further separated.
True, very true.
I think that the insight of the church that politics and charity are intimately connected is one of the most countercultural insights that we have to offer. Pope Francis uses the example in his encyclical letter, Fratelli, Tutti, about building a bridge, that a person might be able to row another person across a river, but if they're a politician, they can help to build a bridge that will allow many people to cross the river. And I think that's a great illustration of what we're talking about here, that politics is a form of love if it's applied appropriately, because it's trying to affirm the common good and affirm human dignity. The problems arise when politics and charity are separated. So in many ways, I see our role as Catholics in the public square as trying to bring politics and charity back together.
That would definitely be a kinder way of doing politics. Absolutely.
Well, it's one that is more consistent, I think, with the founding of our nation, which, after all, was based on a recognition of human dignity and the common good, even if oftentimes those principles were not brought into effect. That, I think, is still the basis on which our body politic was originally founded. And so by bringing politics and charity back together again, in many ways, we're calling the body politic back to the better angels of its nature.
The idealism that we were founded on. Absolutely. That makes a lot of sense. Well, that's something to chew on. So thank you so much for listening to our second podcast in Finding Communion. Again, I'm Rosemary Ford, editor of Parable, and I'm here with Bob Dunn, the director of public policy for the Diocese of Manchester. Thank you so much for joining us. Please check our show notes for links to our articles in Parable magazine and other helpful data. And we'll see you next time on Finding Communion.